Good evening. Those of you who are still standing, if you could please take your seats, we'd like to begin. As a Pelech graduate, it's my honor to host Professor Ali Shalvi here once again at Beit AVI. This time we're here to hear about Professor Shalvi's new book, Never a Native. We also have Amanda Borschel-Dan of the Times of Israel. This is a Beit AVI and Times of Israel partnership. If any phones are still on, okay, this was great. This is time to please silence them. And Amanda and Professor Shalvi will speak. There will be time for questions at the end, so just wait patiently. Erev Tov.
Thank you very much for coming. Can we all hear Professor Shalvi as well? Say something. We're wondering if Professor Shalvi is plugged in. Is she? Yes, very good.
Can I be heard?
Yes, very good.
I'm wild, okay.
So, we're here to speak about this book. No? Okay, in the back rows, they're saying they cannot hear Professor Shalvi. Great. So we're here to speak about Never a Native. And I've been reading it in bite-sized pieces over the past several weeks and discussing it with everyone I meet, including my wonderful neighbor on our walk to school. And as we were walking to school with my 3 little children, ages 9 and under, all of a sudden one of the girls said, "Ima, what is sexism?" Because I was discussing this book, this wonderful book. And the older sister said, "Oh, I know. Sexism is when boys aren't allowed to do what they want to do because they're boys." So I think we have a future feminist in the family, at least. So Professor Shalvi, Alice, the title, Never a Native. Can you tell us a little bit about this? And what citizenship did you have growing up? What languages did you speak? Where were you a native? Or were you at all?
I was born in Germany to parents who had immigrated to Germany. My father's family were all in Germany by 1910, having come from Galicia. My mother came only in 1920. My father brought her. She was his cousin and had been left orphaned after the war. Well, orphaned of a father after the war, and in a very bad situation because the family had lived on the border between Austria and Russia, as Galicia then was, and they were actually stateless. So we were living in Germany, but without German citizenship, which was actually all to the good, because as it, Gamzula Tova, as it turned out, one of the reasons that our house was searched very soon after the Nazis came to power was because my father was active in the Ostjüdische Gemeinde, the community of Jews from the East, from Eastern Europe. He was also active in the local Zionist society, and that apparently made him suspect, and the house was searched, and several days later my father left for England. That was already in 1933. We followed later. We arrived in England in 1934, so we actually qualified for nationalization, receiving British citizenship in 1939, but then the war broke out. The British did not naturalize any foreign subjects, so we were left stateless except for the goodwill of the Polish government in exile, which was located in England, in London, who were prepared to give all the stateless people who had been born in what after 1918 became Poland, to give them a Polish passport, Polish citizenship. So I had Polish citizenship for a very short time, until 1946, did receive British nationality, but in 1949 I already left. And in any case, even without or with British nationality, I never really felt British. And I certainly didn't feel English. British is just a nationality. Anyone who was born in Britain will probably not refer to themselves as British. They'll call themselves either Irish, Scottish, Welsh, or English. So British is a collective term, used to apply to the empire as well. But I was never at home. I was an outsider, partly, mainly, because I was also a Jew. And the British are not, they're not really fond of Jews, I would say. It's not no, what I mean is that the anti-Semitism is, on the whole, except among the very uneducated working class, some of whom would call me a dirty Jew. I had that happen at school. But the upper classes, the better educated classes, will just speak rather coldly. And in fact, in the book, I mention one incident when I was eating dinner at Newnham College with the dons. Students were occasionally invited to sit with the dons at what's known as the high table. And this was the days of rationing during the war. There was sometimes some meat. And if I was sitting at high table when meat was being served, I would be given a chunk of cheese, in which case the following exchange would probably occur. Oh, Miss Margulies, are you a vegetarian? Well, not quite, no. I only eat kosher. Oh, what is that? Well, it means I only eat meat that is slaughtered in a particular manner. Are you by any chance Jewish? Okay. And then I would say, well, actually, yes, I am. That was the end of the conversation. So this genteel anti-Semitism, on the one hand, and on the other hand, a rather fiercer anti-Semitism, because I was known at college as a Zionist, whereas my tutor, being in Oriental studies, being an Arabist, actually, was violently anti-Zionist at the time when we were fighting here to get a state. That coincided with my time at Cambridge. And she was extremely hostile and would very deliberately engage me in an argument on the Jewish claim to a national homeland in Palestine, Eretz Israel. And I was 18 at the time. I really couldn't cope. I couldn't cope with it. I've always been rather frightened of authority anyway. And she simply beat me down. So that anti-Zionism became part of the anti-Semitism, or vice versa. And then finally, I came here. And here, for the first time, I felt I really belonged. I felt I belonged, but I am considered an Anglo-Saxon. So we're still, well, yes, I wasn't born here. But then a lot of my generation who live in the country now, were not born here. The Yekkers, of course, are also labeled, right, because of the way they speak, and the Anglo-Saxons labeled because of the way they speak. So the question is, when do I actually become in the eyes of the native-born Israelis, an Israeli. Right? And I feel that that hasn't happened yet.
Yet, right? Something to look forward to, for sure. While you were in England, of course, World War II was happening on the continent. In your book, you write that some of your happiest days occurred at the same time because you and your family had little idea of what was happening to your family and other Jews under the Nazi rule. Can you talk about when you actually did find out what happened and how it affected you?
I have to correct you in saying that my family was not aware, because my father, who had really been recruited by the Polish government in exile, inter alia to broadcast on the BBC overseas service to Poland in Polish, right, knew what was going on. Ziegelboim came to England in 1943, committed suicide because no one would believe him, no one would listen to him. I saw afterwards, after the war, I found in our bookcase documents which my father had already, but simply didn't reveal to me. I don't know whether my mother was aware of it. They certainly weren't aware of what had happened to their own family, that in both cases brothers had been murdered by the Nazis. That was discovered only at the end of the war. But I certainly had no idea. What made my days, my war days happy was that we evacuated from London at the time of the Blitz in 1940 to a little village called Waddesdon. I went to the local school, nearby school in Aylesbury, the nearest town. And when I think back to those days, apart from being called a dirty Jew, by some of the pupils, I think of a continuous summer of playing tennis, of watching cricket. It was a very, very happy time because, first of all, we had two very good teachers, particularly the history mistress, who was a Cambridge graduate and was excellent and encouraged us to apply for Cambridge, which was not the custom at that particular grammar school. We'd left London. There'd been the terrible period of the Blitz when, although I was going to school, we spent almost our whole days in the shelter. I mean, what I find interesting is that we dutifully went to school carrying our Gast masks, but we never studied at school. And then when the firebombing of London occurred late in 1940, we left for the country. And I suddenly discovered the English countryside and its beauties, its natural beauties. And at that time, particularly when I was about 16, 17, we started studying the Romantic poets, which was so profoundly influenced by and which so profoundly reflect in their works the natural beauties of England. I got a bicycle for my 14th birthday and I cycled around the countryside, which included the Rothschild estate of Waddesdon, which was open to the public. It was there that I had a moment of absolute rapture, which I may later read about. And I had friends. My friends were all, without exception, fellow evacuees, and some of them were Jewish. We were the first Jews that the school had ever had. Right? And it was significant that because we bribed the one teacher who could teach us Latin by arranging for my father to bring cigarettes from London and sneaking them to him, we applied for Oxford or Cambridge for the first time. We were not encouraged by the school officially, even though the headmaster was himself a Cambridge graduate. And although one of us won a state scholarship, one got an exhibition to, which is a kind of scholarship, to Peterhouse in Cambridge. I passed the A-levels with flying colors. When I went back to visit school, before we went back to London, I discovered that none of our names had been put on the school honors board. The only people mentioned on the honors board were the two fellow pupils who completed school at the same time and who were locals. All right, even though it would have redounded to the school's reputation to have another 4, old pupils who had achieved it. And that was, for me, again, such a striking example of the British provincialism. But apart from that, I really, yes, I regret to say that I enjoyed the wartime years.
When did the Holocaust come home for you?
Well, it really came home in the summer of 1946. At Cambridge, in the long vacation term, a number of us from the Jewish Society, in which I was very active, decided that we would invite to spend a day in Cambridge, a Sunday in Cambridge, a group of youngsters. We called them displaced persons then, not Holocaust survivors, who had been brought to England and were in a hostel in the East End of London. Now, we went to the station to meet them. I'd had no idea of several things. First of all, what they would look like. They had shaven heads, which at the time in England simply didn't exist. They were wearing hand-me-down clothes, some of which didn't fit. And above all, they didn't know a word of English. And I was the only one in our group who knew German and a bit of and Yiddish, but they didn't know much Yiddish, and they didn't know that much German, for that matter. So communication was virtually nil. And they weren't interested in sightseeing. I mean, many of you know how beautiful a town Cambridge is, but they didn't want that. They wanted food. Food on a Sunday, kosher food on a Sunday in wartime Cambridge was hard to come by, but there was one kosher restaurant, and we persuaded the owner to open up for us. And what he served, again, you have to remember this was wartime, was sausages and chips. And the only way I can describe the way in which our guests behaved, they pounced on the food, they ate it with their hands, they wanted more, the cutlery was not used at all. It was like seeing someone who had been kept in starvation conditions for a very, very long time. And this was even after they'd already been in England for some time. So then we wanted to take them on the river. They didn't want to go on the river. They wanted cigarettes, and it wasn't easy to get cigarettes on a Sunday in Cambridge. But the men among us managed to find some. They were very angry at not being given a whole pack each. So after a while, sitting in silence, having tea, we took them back to the station much earlier than we'd attended. And I realized for the first time that there was a new breed of what we now call Holocaust survivors. Right? And it was actually a very important turning point in my life, because it made me decide that when I went to Eretz Israel, and I mean when, because I knew that I would go to Eretz Israel. Aliyah was in my life from a very early age. I would want to work with what we now call Holocaust survivors. So when I finished my degree a year later, I went on to the London School of Economics and did a postgraduate diploma in social work and came here. The next event was also in 1946 when I participated in the first Zionist Congress, post-war Zionist Congress in Basel in December of 46. And I was a delegate to what was known as the Youth Zionist Congress. And the Congress began with a reading aloud of the names of all the communities that had been destroyed. I shall never forget that moment, the long list as it went on, and the sobbing and the weeping, and my parents sitting next to me sobbing. And you realized, I realized for the first time, the immensity of the disaster, the immensity of the loss, right? We didn't yet talk about 6 million. Right, that came, but just by hearing that list of the destroyed communities, you realize that European Jewry had been wiped out, in fact. Right? The interesting thing about that Zionist conference was that in spite of the emotion, the grief which we shared, it was a Congress full of conflict. The conflict between Ben-Gurion and Weizmann, the attacks on Weizmann, the personal attacks by Ben-Gurion, the way in which I personally felt that the man to whom we owed so much, the man who was responsible for getting us the Balfour Declaration, was being insulted, cast off. Right? And it made me realize that even though we all share in grief, right, we are terribly a fractured nation when it comes to politics. And I think...
Until today.
I don't want to get onto that subject just yet.
We'll get to politics a bit later, don't worry. We're going to fast forward.
The irony was that when I came to Israel in November 49, having got my diploma in social work, I couldn't find social work because it turned out that the Holocaust survivors did not yet need the help of social work. The psychosis broke out only about 6 years later, around 1955, 1956, that a psychiatrist cousin of mine, who'd also immigrated from Europe, told me that for the first time he was seeing patients who had been through the Holocaust. The public that required social work was the new immigrants from the Arab countries, and I didn't speak any of the relevant languages, couldn't find a job for 2 months, until by chance I found a job teaching at the Hebrew University and discovered that teaching was, after all, a wonderful profession.
Much to the credit of the country, for sure. When you arrived in Israel, several months later, you met your husband, your to-be husband, Moshe. There's a lovely picture in the book, a photograph of Moshe and Alice at a protest, a woman in black protest. And Moshe is standing with a poster on top of his head and shielding himself, of course, but also Alice from the rays of the sun. Does this symbolize your partnership that you had for over 60 years?
I was very fortunate in finding a real partner in life. When I think of ourselves now that he's no longer with me, I think of the way in which we complemented each other. We were very different, and that was what made it a good match. You know? We were different, but we understood each other. We loved each other, obviously. But we understood, we supported each other. I would never have been able to accomplish what I did without Moshe's partnership. Incessant support, dedication. Just going through some papers in my archives recently, which I've donated to the National Library, by the way, I found that while I was busy traveling at the time that I was chairing the Israel Women's Network, I was heading Pelech, and I was still teaching at the Hebrew University, all at the same time. And I was traveling fundraising in addition. He was answering my emails saying, Alice is away, or Professor Shalvi is away. She will be back on such and such a day. I don't think that there are many couples who enjoy precisely that kind of relationship. And I always helped him with his work. And when he got to his final, the cherry on the icing of his comprehensive historical encyclopedia of Jewish women, which was created in-house in our house, I served as the assistant editor. And it really, at last, I felt that I was truly repaying him for everything that he'd done for me in the course of my career.
In the book, you speak, of course, about your life and your work. It's really a feast for any kind of reporter to ask about, but our time is getting short. So I'm going to ask, do you have any regrets? You were a wife, a mother, a professor, an activist, a principal, an educator, of course. Do you have any regrets in how you made this balance of your mix of identities right now, looking back at your age today?
You're talking about my regret at being a bad mother.
See, you say bad mother, but for me, somebody who is 43 and trying to do some of the same mix that you're doing, I think maybe you're beating yourself up.
It's an interesting point because I recall very well an incident at the Friday night table when all my children were still at home, no one was yet married. My oldest son must have been almost going into the army, into the forces. He was in the Navy. And I just read an article in the London Observer by a brilliant journalist, Catherine Whitehorn, talking about the issue. It was the time of Betty Friedan's feminine mystique, right? The number of women frustrated because they were stuck at home as housewives, having earned a university degree, right? And I asked them how they felt. I asked my children how they felt about my being absent so much. And my second son said, "You're not always home when we need you." To which the oldest of my daughters, who was next in line after that son, she was 2.5 years younger than him, replied, "But when you are at home, you're much more interesting than those mothers who spend all their time polishing the windows." And I seized on what she said, right, and ignored what he said. And for that I feel guilt, because it is very difficult. I think I think we're living through a real change, but I'll come to that in a moment, if I may. It's very hard to combine being a full-time parent with also being very full-time engaged in whatever one's doing outside the home. I was very fortunate in that at a certain point, just when I took on the network as well, my father-in-law, it's funny to say, I was fortunate. My father-in-law became ill and came to live with us, and Moshe left his job and took over the homemaking completely. And he was a wonderful cook, really, really great. But if that hadn't happened, then neither of us would have been around. And yes, I do feel guilt. And I think this is a problem which society has not yet dealt with. Government has not yet dealt with it, right? I think it should be possible for a couple, for human beings, not just a married couple, to be able to be involved maximally in family and in employment. And when I say family, I don't mean just children. I mean family in the terms of, particularly now when we have the sandwich generation of more and more elderly parents having to be cared for by their children, who are also parents of children who need parenting, right? So I'm using family in the wider sense. We should be able to combine work, family, and community, right? In such a way as to be able to care for one's family adequately, to be able to earn an adequate living, right? And to be communally engaged, whether it's locally or whether it's in politics, whether in terms of the country, right? That should be feasible. Now, that means we need a structural change. We need a change in paradigm. Parenting has to be recognized as a full-time job, right? And that means, I think, things like longer parental leave for both parents, not first one, then the other. Both parents should be able to have at least 6 weeks, if not more, together with a newborn child, particularly the first one. The first one is, you're new, you don't know what to do, you're lost, right?
We were definitely lost after our first child. I remember the day of the Brit, my parents coming to visit, and we could not get out of bed. We were so exhausted from this baby who didn't even move an inch at that point. It's really a shock.
Yes. Yes. And then, in addition, there should be flexible work hours. We haven't introduced flexi time. It's not essential for everybody to be at work from 9 to 3 or 4, right? You can have home working as well. Easy, as our modes of communication develop, that becomes easier and easier. Although I've found that not everybody wants to work only from home. They also want to come into work to meet their fellow employees. So one has to allow for that. But I know that from having witnessed it in one place when I was at Wellesley College in America as a fellow at the Center for Research on Women, that they had flexi time for their secretaries. The secretaries could choose whether they chose the morning, whether they worked the morning session, or whether they worked the afternoon session. They could choose which day of the week they wanted to work full-time, and they would leave notes for whoever was taking over. So between them, they worked a full job, but not simultaneously all the time. And it requires a bit of ingenuity, and it requires goodwill, and yes, it requires money. And I would say a little less money spent on defense and weaponry, particularly if it's not essential, like the submarines we purchased, right? And more was spent on social issues, like making it possible for people to have a family, to be involved with family, to be gainfully employed, and to be active members contributing to the welfare of community. This should be possible. It is possible. But you need the goodwill of the government. You need, as I say, a changed paradigm.
So interestingly, in the elections that are coming up, one of the parties, the New Right Party, has recruited so many women so far. Most of the published candidates on their list are women, all sorts of different women, deaf women, pregnant women, very right-wing women, Anglo-Saxon women, all sorts of women. What do you see as the duty of female Knesset members or female leaders in general? Do they have a duty to womankind?
Yes, of course they have. I mean, no matter whether they're left-wing or right-wing or the center, which seems to be growing enormously, they are women. And I think that their major loyalty has to be to the feminine, female population, right? Which is still underrepresented, underpaid, right? Discriminated against, right? Made to go out on pension earlier than men, although that's been adjusted now with a law that the Women's Network managed to have passed years ago. Whatever you believe as far as the left-right wing divide is concerned, which is, I think if one sort of speaks in a very generalized way, is between a greater Israel and whatever's left of a two-state solution, whatever you feel politically on that, as a woman, you must still be committed to women's issues. And we now have, as a result of the success of the Israel Women's Network in the '92 elections and getting feminists elected, not a larger number, but strong feminists elected, there's now a committee on the advancement of the status of women. And I think that all women members of Knesset should be active on that committee. Unfortunately, I've learned from Ida Tumin Solomon that who chairs the committee, that very few women show up for the meetings. And the one person who shows up all the time is member of Knesset Glick. He comes to every single meeting. Right? Now, I wonder whether it wasn't a deliberate move by somebody to appoint an Arab member of Knesset as the chair of that committee. I wonder whether some of the right-wing women don't want to come to a committee headed by an Arab. Right? That's something else. That may be an issue.
Possibly. Also, for my generation, I know the word feminist has taken on all these connotations of being aggressive, of being unpleasant, of being this nasty person. And so many of my cohort would say, no, I'm not a feminist. And then I ask them, but don't you believe in equality of the sexes, etc.? Equality in general? They say, of course. So you are a feminist. But it could very well be that the fact that these women are in a leadership position, they're saying, no, I've made it. I'm here. I am the living proof.
Yes, that's always been the problem. The women who've made it and who say, well, if I've made it, anybody can, which is nonsense, of course. I mean, it's nonsense. If you just think about it, right? Not anyone can get in, and not anybody can get to the highest position. There is distinct discrimination against women, which I myself experience. I mean, what awakened me to the inequality in Israeli society, which I always sort of blissfully thought, oh, everything is equal, we're all equal, was when I was seconded by Hebrew University to set up the English department at Beersheba in what was then called the Institute for Higher Education in the Negev, and has since become Ben Gurion. Wonderful university, partly because for 12 years it had a marvelous woman at its head. At one point when the dean was going to resign, all the teachers actually were brought from Jerusalem, almost all. And I'd done a very good job in setting up the English department. I'd been elected by my colleagues to every position that my colleagues had the right to elect someone to. And the time came when a new dean had to be chosen. And I had the temerity to indicate that I'd like the position. And so the person who had the highest rank in the ladder in Beersheba said, okay, well, go and tell people you want to be, suggest it. So I was in the humiliating position of having to go see the rector and the dean at Hebrew University, who were in charge, the rector, the president, the dean in Beersheba, the two directors general as well, for what reason I don't know, and saying, I'd like to be considered for the position of dean. The sentence, the first sentence that came out of the mouth of every single one of them, except for one who immediately corrected himself, was, but you're a woman. Okay? 1975. Yeah, 1975. I was appalled. I was stunned. Right? And I went back to, I didn't get the job, obviously, because I was a woman. And that's why it's so ironic that the university has really grown and thrived under a woman president. Right? And I started speaking to some of my women colleagues at Hebrew University and discovered, to my horror, that every single one of them has suffered from one kind of discrimination or another because she was a woman. And even what was interesting, what's particularly interesting now that we have the Me Too movement, right, is that in a veiled way, very many of them implied that there had been some kind of sexual harassment involved, of the kind that, well, if you want a better grade, then, or, well, if you really want me to suggest put you in for promotion, then, okay, right? They'd all been too ashamed to talk about it. And now when I came and we started asking, and all of a sudden we discovered this general phenomenon of discrimination, of what we now realize is sexual harassment, right? We started to do something about it. And actually the local feminist movement, which then led later to the setting up of the Israel Women's Network in 1984, began at the universities with highly educated women. Right? And then we managed to get ombudswomen at each of the universities and so on, went on and on. But it took a long time to break through this barrier. The ridicule when some of us proposed women's studies. Women's studies? Well, we don't have men's studies, do we? So go and explain that the whole of history is actually history, not herstory, right? That much of the literature taught is by men, that the women writers are largely neglected, overlooked. Right? It wasn't until I started teaching a course on women in drama in the English department that anyone had thought of doing something like that. Right? Actually, it wasn't just women, it was women, love, and marriage. It was a tall order. And in the end, after really infighting in the faculty meetings with very, very strong opposition from the men, we managed to get through the establishment of a gender studies subsidiary, not a department, sort of second choice thing. And there are still no women's studies anywhere in, no, that's not true. There are now, but not at the Hebrew University. It has a center for research on women, but no courses specifically, no department devoted. And that may be all right if there's enough teaching on women in everything else, right? Then you don't need necessarily a women's studies department, although that's open to debate.
There's so much more I would love to ask you, but I think we should turn to our final topic that we agreed that we'll speak about. There's so much more I'd like to discuss with you, but let's turn to your religious evolution as our time is drawing to a close. One passage in the book brought me to tears. It's when you were in Milwaukee, which is coincidentally where I was born.
Oh.
But you're in Milwaukee, and you were called to the Torah for the first time in your life. I read it this Shabbat, tears rolling down my face, because your encounter for the first time with the Torah is so moving. Could you explain a little bit how you felt?
Well, this was at a time that I was being invited to be a scholar in residence at various places. And I had been sent by the Jewish Agency, actually, to Milwaukee. And I was due to speak at what I discovered was a conservative center. I was very ignorant about the differences between modern Orthodox conservative. I knew what reform was, but I didn't really know anything about conservative. And didn't realize it was a conservative synagogue. I was invited to a synagogue to speak. And when I came, I discovered that it was going to be the women's Shabbat, the Women's League Shabbat, and that there was going to be a separate tefillah for women only. I never experienced anything like that before. It was amazing for me to see women who could lead a service, who had total command of synagogue skills, everything, right? Including, of course, reading the Torah. And many of them were wearing talitot. This was something completely new to me. So I sat in a kind of amazement, days right through. And then came the Torah Service. And suddenly someone came up to me and asked whether I'd like an aliyah. And I was very startled. I had to look around and see whether there wasn't anybody there who'd report me a Pelech, where I would be condemned as a heretic. I was already rather in the bad graces of the authorities. And I agreed. And I went up, and suddenly I saw the Torah scroll for the first time in my life, open in front of me, legible, right? The black letters on the white parchment. Right? And I said the bracha, and then I burst into tears. I just burst into tears because they were tears of rage. I was 53 at the time. Had I been a man, I would have had that experience 40 years earlier. Right? I'd had to wait an additional 40 years to experience this. They were tears of rage. They were tears of profound emotion and gratification and thanks, gratitude. So that when I made the final bracha, I added a Shechianu. And I looked up and I saw that quite a few of the women were, like yourself on reading the description, I find that amazing, were moved to tears with me. The older ones in particular, because they remembered a time when women could not be called to the Torah, and still were not being called to the Torah in the mixed Minyanim. It was only because it was a women's Shabbat, Women's League Shabbat, that was happening. Right? That was a very critical moment in my life. I'd been feeling for a long time a sense of not totally belonging in orthodoxy. Actually, from a very early age, I'd felt very discriminated against in synagogue by having to sit in what was in England was called the ladies' gallery, which speaks for itself. I don't think the lower part's called the gentleman's section. I don't know what it is. It's the synagogue, right? That's where the ladies' gallery, if you're not sitting in the front row, you can usually neither hear nor see very much. And I'll tell you a little story about that in a moment, if I may. But I felt very excluded. I tried once when I was at Simchat Torah with my father at the festivities of the Rebbe, with whom he was a Hasid and where he would go on Simchat Torah, to lead the Rebbe's daughters in just singing and dancing, but within minutes we were silenced by someone coming in angrily and telling us it's forbidden for women to sing. Right? And then really increasingly feeling excluded, my husband started the practice in our congregation of bringing the Sefer Torah into the women's section, which was at least on the same level as the men's, only to be hissed at by some of the older women saying, Asur, Asur. You know. So go start explaining Shazilo Asur, you know. And then I, by chance, became a conservative. It was really by chance. I don't want to go into that. I mean, that was quite by chance. I did attend our local conservative synagogue, Masorti synagogue, for a while, but I felt very uncomfortable in the mixed seating, I must say. And I was the only woman wearing a hat. But then, yes, well, I don't want to go into why. I accidentally was described in a news item as a conservative. And I'd just become rector of the Schechter Institute of Jewish Studies, which is a conservative Masorti institution. So I became a conservative. All right, okay. And that was better. because for the first time I was called to the Torah. For the first time I was made kalat bereshit at the synagogue, right? Well, you know, to be able to hold the Torah and dance with it in my arm, this is an extraordinary elation that fills you, right? But then even that was not enough. Shall I read the final section?
Alice will read a section from the book, and then afterwards we'll have a little time, if you still have patience, for some questions. She has a long life, it's a lot to cover, so we're running a little late. So let's listen to Alice.
I have to apologize. I'm suffering from an eye infection, but I hope I'll make it. It's only 2 pages. 20 years ago, I began in optimistic mood to write my memoirs. I had retired from work, both salaried and voluntary. I was in Bellagio, a land of cocaine designed specifically to stimulate, enable, and encourage intellectual and artistic creativity. It was a balmy, rainless late summer with Lake Como below and mountains all around. I went back to Jerusalem with 30,000 words completed. Years passed before I returned to the manuscript and continued writing. Now, almost all is changed. I have no husband. I share my home. I am at a loss for words. My erstwhile eloquence and rich vocabulary dissipated. It is not now as it hath been of yore. Turn wheresoe'er I may by night or day, the things which I have seen, I now can see no more. Moments of being. Bicycling in Waddesdon Park, I round a bend and light, startled, upon a bank of golden daffodils, surprised by joy. Heard for the first time the urgent liberame of Verdi's Requiem soars to the rafters of King's College Chapel. My scalp tingles. Late summer afternoons, the near silence of my garden, with only a soft twitter of birds calling to each other, come home, come home. Alone, seated in the vast expanse of the Sinai Desert, waiting for my companions to return from hiking through a wadi, an intense stillness, the presence of God. On the steps of the dwellings of tranquility, opposite me, on the other side of the valley of Hinnom, the late afternoon sun gilds the great stone walls of the old city. Chimes herald evensong. A muezzin's wail summons the faithful to prayer, the end of the day in the holy city. Sorry. Softness and peace and joy and love and bliss, exalted manner, gladness of the best, heaven in ordinary, man well dressed, the Milky Way, the bird of paradise, church bells beyond the stars heard, the soul's blood, the land of spices, something understood. And now, the words no longer suffice. The traditional prayer book neither embodies my belief or expresses my innermost feelings. I can no longer pray to the Lord, the Father, the King. The divine spirit that inspires me knows no gender. Unlimited in time and space, vast and all-embracing, it is a source of universal love, sustenance, joy. Schiller knew it. Beethoven expressed it in music that lifts the soul. Seit umschlungen Millionen diesen Kuss der ganzen Welt, droben übern starren Zelt muss ein großer Vater wohnen. Be embraced, O ye millions, by this kiss of the whole world. There, above the tent of stars, must a loving Father dwell. To that force, that source of life itself, I now address my songs of praise and gratitude. It inspires me to love all aspects of creation. It leads me to seek out the best, the noblest in myself, in others. It bids me love my fellow creatures. It leads us upwards to the firmament, to perceive the wonders of nature, the depth of human feeling, the height of human achievement. It is everywhere around us, challenging us to awaken to its presence, beckoning us, summoning us to create a better world, a world of fellowship and human kindness. All that is required of us is to open our hearts to welcome and embrace it. No words are needed. No words suffice. Just as two lovers sit side by side in silence, each absorbing the other's presence, so I sit, absorbing and at the same time surrendering myself to the divine spirit. Epiphanies, sanctity, exaltation.
Do we have patience and energy for some questions? Are we doing okay? Okay. So we're waiting for the microphone. So in the meantime, I will ask another question, if I may. Take the opportunity. Alice, you are Alice Shalvi. It troubles me so much to hear about your regrets of being a working mother. Do you have any words of encouragement for this working mother of 6 children, for a woman who wants to fulfill herself, for somebody who feels that she has a shlichut, some kind of vocation to bring certain topics or to help the world in a certain way through her profession?
Well, the most obvious answer is you have to find a Moshe.
I have a barak.
No, I think that in creating a marital partnership, well, not marital, not every partnership today is marital, but in creating a partnership in which both partners wish to fulfill precisely those 3 functions that I mentioned, right? To raise a family, to earn an income, to be involved, you have to have total sharing of responsibility. And I think, I find now, if I'm not mistaken, that more and more couples, particularly those who are creating their own wedding ceremonies, writing their own ketubah, which is becoming more and more common now, certainly among more educated and conscious people. You know, it's not just education, it's being aware of the need for reciprocity, that they are building that reciprocity into the ketubah, into the wedding ceremony. The number of ceremonies where the woman now gives the man a ring, and in many cases accompanies it with words similar to the Harei At Mekudeshet Li. So I think there is something happening in society. I think that in a certain level of the population, class is an outmoded word, I think, this is happening increasingly. It's just that, as I said before, a society does not yet enable that total reciprocity.
As an aside, whenever one of our children is sick and I'm working, because I do work, I have to write a note for my husband's work that he is taking care of them because I'm busy. It's a crazy, crazy situation.
It's crazy.
Yes, okay, let's take some...
That's not crazy, that's sinful.
It is.
It's criminal. It's criminal.
I agree,
Absolutely.
I agree. Yes.
Firstly, I wanted to say thank you for giving us this opportunity to hear you speak and to hear about your life. So thank you for that. I had a number of questions that I wanted to ask, but obviously I'm limited to just one. So I wanted to perhaps know if you had any ideas or further insight to provide on bringing the experience that you had of bringing the Torah in to women who perhaps wouldn't be comfortable of approaching it themselves, but bringing the Torah to them on a more personal level that they would not necessarily have experienced at the time of their own bat mitzvah, for example.
Okay, you have to repeat that.
Do you have any ideas how to bring the Torah to women who don't have an experience with it themselves?
Say that again.
Do you have any ideas how to create encounters between women and Torah, especially for women who have not experienced it?
Well, I'll tell you, I was very fortunate. Well, there are various ways. First of all, study. I mean, obviously, that's the best way of encountering Torah. And I'm happy to say that there are an increasing number of women, both orthodoxly observant and in various, belonging to various types of organized Judaism, and a lot of secular women now who are studying Torah. It's become increasingly common. And so the best way is, first of all, to study it, and then you're sitting at least with a Tanakh in your hands, right? Which isn't the same as the Sefer Torah. The other is to belong to a congregation or to establish a congregation for yourself where women do enjoy all the benefits, if you like, or the privileges that men enjoy. I've been very blessed insofar as my current congregation is concerned. It was set up in a way specifically for me by a former Pelech graduate, needless to say, who also studied at Chapter when I was rector at Chapter. And we have a very close relationship. And in all the years that I was complaining that I had nowhere where I could pray feeling really wholehearted about my prayer, she would say, I will establish a Minyan for you. And she did. 5.5 years ago, she established Seon, which is totally pluralist. It has Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Yemenite, you name it. Its motto is, come as you are. Some men come without a kippah, some men come with a kippah. The service is beautiful. There's music, not on Shabbat or Yom Tov, but otherwise there's the song. But in the summer we have instrumental music at Kabbalat Shabbat as well. She herself is a visionary. Her Divrei Torah are gems. She's just a superb human being, and the congregation has fulfilled all my needs of a congregation. But as I think I made clear in that final passage, that's not what I'm looking for at the moment. That's not what I need. I love it socially, but religiously, I don't need it. But as far as women encountering Torah, there are many, many ways, and I encourage you, everybody finds a way, whether within a synagogue, within some kind of service, or simply in study. There are an enormous number of places to do it now, no problem. There weren't in my time, but there are now.
Another question? Yes?
My question is about women writing their own memoirs. The Australian expatriate president of Smith College, Jill Kerr-Conway, has written that it is very rare for women to write their own memoirs. And in some of the work that I do, doing oral histories with women, often when I ask them if I can undertake an interview, their response is, "Oh, but I'm not special." And that we're less likely to hear about women's lives. I think this audience is testament to the interest in hearing about women's lives. Can you tell us, Alice, what encouraged you to sit down to do this, and how you would encourage other women to share their life stories with us?
So there are very few women memoirists, she is saying.
Who
Few women who write their memoirs, often because they feel they're not special. What compelled you to write your memoir?
Oh, God. Nothing compelled me. Yes, what? Actually, I started with a completely different concept. When I retired for the first time, I keep on retiring, but when I retired for the first time, I realized that I had had the privilege of being closely associated with a number of significant institutions and organizations, beginning with my work at the Hebrew University on the 1st of January 1950, where I was able over the years to help create the syllabus, help make the English department one of the most outstanding in the Faculty of Humanities, if not the most outstanding, with a wonderful reputation for human relations, both among the faculty and between faculty and students, right? And that I'd witnessed a real development of the Hebrew University, including the establishment of Beersheba University. So there was that. Then I had been in the 1970s involved with the first social revolution, which began immediately after the Yom Kippur War in the Katamonim, where for the first time some of the local youths rebelled, set up a local community called Ohel Yosef, and I don't want to go into how it happened, and I became the chair of the supervising committee, which any organization has to have, the overseeing committee. And that introduced me to a completely different world that I'd never known, the world of the slums, the overcrowding, the poverty, the crime, the drugs, right? And it became an extraordinary power locally, and it developed into the Ohalim movement, right? Then there was Beersheba itself. Then there was the Israel Women's Network, Pelech, which I began to head in 1975, if I go chronologically, and which I headed until 1990, when my feminism and my meetings with Palestinians displeased the a religious education department of the Ministry of Education to such an extent that they warned me that if I did not desist from my activities, they would remove the official accreditation, to cancel the accreditation of Pelech as a religious school. So I wasn't prepared to give up my activities, so I left Pelech. But the Pelech experiment was amazing, and has had an incredible effect on education. I mean, there's now a boys' Pelech, which I find rather amusing, because no, Pelech means a spindle, and the name was originally chosen by the Rosenblüts, who had a good sense of wit, because of the Talmudic saying by some misogynist sage, woman's wisdom is only in the spindle. En chochmat isha ela befelach. Yes? So they made Pelech, and if you wanted women's wisdom, you came to Pelech. And now Pelech graduates have set up more Pelechs, and it's also influenced other schools, and it really is extraordinary. And the network also, the 15 years in which I headed the network, revolutionized the status of women. There was more litigation, there was more legislation related to women. Women became more active, women became aware of the inferiority of women. When I first started traveling around the country, telling people about the status of women. No, lo nachon, vadai, of course we have equality. The kibbutzim were the worst for that, right? We're equal. Yes, I would say, really. Have you ever had a woman secretary, which is the most powerful position in a kibbutz? Well, actually, no. Have you ever had a woman treasurer? Well, no, actually not, right? The boys get driving lessons because they may have to drive a tractor. The girls were denied driving lessons. But none of the women had ever thought about these issues, right? The consciousness raising that we engaged in the first case, and then the litigation, the case of Nominevaux about equal retirement age, the case of Alice Miller, who'd applied to become a pilot for pilot training, was denied specifically because she was a woman. Both of those became important Supreme Court decisions. Right? So the 15 years, my 15 years at the network also saw really enormous changes. And I wanted to write about the organizations, not about me, right?
I think there are plenty of reasons.
Gradually, the personal came in, and when I reread it with a view to possible publication and revision, I decided that those parts were boring. And what was really, I mean, we did this, we did that, we did A, B, C, D. No, I think the time has come for someone for a number of people, to do their doctoral work, research on those organizations, particularly on Pelech and the Israel Women's Network. And I hope somebody will. But I realized that wasn't really what I was good at explaining, and so it became more of a memoir than I'd originally intended it to be.
As someone whose son benefits from a Pelech graduate in his high school, I thank you. I think we have time for one more question. Anyone out there? Brave soul?
Yep.
Yes, thank you.
Hebrew is a gendered language. I wonder if you've given thought to the opportunities and the challenges that the Hebrew language itself offers in terms of equality.
Of course. Hebrew is a gendered language. It has no neutral form. Everything has to be either masculine or feminine, which is why I had difficulty with the divine spirit. I have difficulty with God, right? I say, I know Adon and Melech, V'av, that's not my God, right? But my God is also not a female God, right? So what is it? What is, there's no, so it's a spirit, it's a ruach. Yeah? But even ruach in Hebrew has a gender to it. No, the language is really difficult. I agree that the binary quality of Hebrew makes it difficult to find, the she, he thing. It also, you can't do it. It's cumbersome. Somebody at the Vad Halashon should think up a different way of referring to people, objects, etc. But that's going to take a long time. The Hebrew language has been around too long to be modified in an instant.
Thank you, Alice. We're going to exit together. Please. Thank you.